The plain is flat. Almost perfectly flat. That is the first thing you notice. Standing on the banks of the Aufidus River in southern Italy, in the late summer of 216 BC, you would see a landscape designed by geography to offer no advantage to anyone. No hills to retreat to, no forests to disappear into, no narrow passes to hold. Just open ground, stretching in every direction under a sky already growing pale with morning heat. The Romans chose this field deliberately. They had studied the terrain, they had consulted their generals, and they had concluded that on flat open ground with enough men, they could not lose. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong that conclusion was. Somewhere across that plain, a man was already awake. He had not slept. Not because he was afraid. Fear had been scraped out of Hannibal Barca years before this day. He had not slept because he was thinking. Because the trap he had designed over weeks of careful observation, weeks of studying Roman behavior and Roman pride and Roman certainty, was now hours away from being sprung. He knew something the Romans did not. He knew that their greatest strength, their overwhelming numbers, their rigid discipline, their absolute belief in the crushing power of a direct assault, was not a weapon today. Today, it was a mechanism. And he had built a machine designed to use that mechanism against them. 80,000 Roman soldiers would march onto that field, believing they were about to end a war. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 of them would be dead. Senators, consuls, veterans who had fought since before most of these boys were born. All of them on a single afternoon, on a single field, by a single act of military genius the ancient world had never seen and would not see again. This is the story of Cannae, the most devastating military defeat in Roman history. A battle so complete, so geometrically perfect in its destruction, that military commanders from Napoleon to Rommel would study it 2,000 years later, trying to understand how one man, outnumbered and far from home, turned an entire army into a closed fist and crushed everything inside it. Before we begin this journey through one of the most forgotten and brutal stories of southern Italy, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Write your location in the comments, and if this is your first time on the channel, subscribe. Because what follows is a story the chronicles barely recorded, but memory never let go. The Aufidus River is still there. The plain is still flat. And if you stand in the right place at the right time of year, the wind still moves the way it moved that morning. Hot, dry, pushing south from the interior. The Romans called it the Vulturnus. Hannibal used it as a weapon too. But before we can understand what happened on that field, we need to understand the world that made it inevitable. The world that produced Rome. The world that produced Hannibal. And the collision course that had been building across the Western Mediterranean for more than a generation. Because Cannae did not begin on the morning of August 2nd, 216 BC. It began with an oath. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, Rome was no longer simply a city. It was a system, a vast interlocking architecture of alliances, obligations, legions, and roads that had absorbed the Italian peninsula piece by piece, not always by conquest, but by the slower, more durable mechanisms of dependency and fear. The Roman Republic operated on a logic that was almost biological in its consistency. It expanded not because it planned to rule the world, but because the alternative, stagnation, surrounded by rivals, was existential. Every new alliance created new borders. Every new border created new threats. Every new threat justified another war. And every war, won or lost, left Rome more powerful than it had been before. The legions were the instrument of this logic. By 216 BC, the Roman military system had been refined over centuries into something formidable. The legion was not simply a mass of infantry. It was a structured organism, divided into maniples, smaller units that could respond to changing battlefield conditions with a flexibility that most ancient armies lacked. Roman soldiers were disciplined, drilled, and psychologically prepared for the brutal arithmetic of close-quarters combat. They trained to advance, to hold, and to push, Forward momentum was the essence of Roman tactical thinking, but this logic had a shadow. The very certainty that made Rome powerful also made it brittle in ways it could not recognize from inside. Romans trusted systems, they trusted precedent, they trusted the superiority of numbers and discipline, and that trust, in the wrong circumstances, with the wrong enemy, could be made to work against them. Across the Mediterranean, in the city of Carthage on the northern coast of Africa, a different kind of power had emerged. Carthage was not a military society in the Roman mold. It was a commercial empire, wealthy, cosmopolitan, and utterly dependent on its capacity to project naval and mercantile power across the sea lanes of the western Mediterranean. Where Rome built roads, Carthage built harbors. Where Rome raised legions from citizen farmers, Carthage hired professional armies from across its sphere of influence. Numidian horsemen, Spanish infantry, Libyan spearmen, Gauls from the north. This difference was not simply organizational, it was philosophical. Carthaginian armies were diverse by design, composed of fighters from different cultures who brought different skills and different styles of war to the same battlefield. A Carthaginian general had to be capable of orchestrating complexity, of combining cavalry and infantry, heavy and light troops, in coordinated movements that could respond in real time. The best Carthaginian commanders were conductors of a violent and unpredictable orchestra. Rome had not yet fought a commander capable of playing that instrument at the level of Hannibal Barca. The First Punic War, which had ended in 241 BC with a Roman naval victory and Carthaginian surrender, had humiliated Carthage and stripped it of Sicily, its most valuable western possession. The peace terms had been designed to diminish Carthage permanently, and for a generation, it seemed they had succeeded. What Rome could not see was what the humiliation had done inside one particular Carthaginian family. His name was Hamilcar, and before his son Hannibal became the nightmare that would haunt Roman sleep for 16 years, it was Hamilcar Barca who planted the seed. The history of ancient sources is not perfectly consistent on all details of Hannibal's early life, but the tradition preserved by writers including Livy and Polybius offers a portrait that is, at its core, psychologically coherent. Hamilcar was a general who believed Carthage's defeat in the First Punic War had been a failure of resources, not of will. He was not broken by the loss of Sicily, he was sharpened by it. When Hannibal was still a child, the ancient sources place him at around 9 years old. He reportedly begged his father to take him to Spain, where Hamilcar was planning to build a new base of power for Carthage in the silver-rich territories of the Iberian Peninsula. Hamilcar agreed, but only after asking his son to swear a solemn oath at the sacrificial altar. The exact wording varies across sources, but the meaning is consistent. The child swore to be an enemy of Rome for as long as he lived. Whether the scene happened exactly as described is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that Hannibal spent his formative years embedded in a military campaign, learning under one of the most gifted commanders of his generation, in a theater where Carthaginian forces were constantly managing multi-ethnic armies against resistant Iberian tribes across difficult terrain. He did not study war, he lived it. Hamilcar died in battle in 228 BC, likely in a skirmish near modern-day Hellas, in southeastern Spain. Hannibal was around 20 years old. He continued serving under his brother-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, who continued the consolidation of Carthaginian power in Spain until Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BC. At that point, the Carthaginian army in Spain did something unusual. The soldiers acclaimed Hannibal as their commander. He was 25 or 26 years old. Within 2 years, he had seized the Spanish city of Saguntum, a Roman ally, and triggered the Second Punic War. Within the following year, he had done something even Rome had not considered physically possible. He had marched an army, infantry, cavalry, and war elephants, from Spain through southern France, across the Alps in late autumn, and into northern Italy. The crossing of the Alps was catastrophic in terms of losses. Ancient sources give varying numbers, but by the time Hannibal descended into the Po Valley, his army had been reduced significantly from its original strength. He had lost soldiers to ambushes, cold, starvation, and the sheer brutality of mountain terrain in winter conditions. None of it seemed to matter, because what Hannibal brought down from the Alps was not just an army. He brought a mind that had been thinking about Rome, its habits, its arrogance, its tactical assumptions, for his entire adult life. And he brought a quality that would define every engagement of the war: the ability to understand what his enemy expected and to give them the exact opposite. At the Trebia River in December of 218 BC, he baited a Roman force into crossing a freezing river at dawn and attacking before they could properly form up, then hit them from the flanks and rear simultaneously. The Romans lost perhaps 25 to 30,000 men. At Lake Trasimene in April of 217 BC, he concealed an entire army in the hills above a narrow lakeside road and waited for Roman legions to march in column through the fog before attacking from multiple directions at once. The Romans lost approximately 15,000 men and their consul Gaius Flaminius. Two catastrophic defeats. Two demonstrations that Roman tactical assumptions could be exploited. And yet Rome did not collapse. It adapted, slowly, reluctantly, and imperfectly, and it kept fighting. It sent a new kind of general, Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose strategy was not to engage Hannibal directly, but to shadow him, cut his supply lines, and wear him down through attrition. The Romans called this approach cautious. They also called it cowardly. The political pressure to fight, to respond to the humiliation of Trebia and Trasimene with Roman steel, was enormous. And in 216 BC, Rome gave in to that pressure. The Roman Republic had a dual consul system. In ordinary years, two consuls shared executive authority, their powers designed to check one another. In wartime, when a single decisive command was considered necessary, Rome could appoint a dictator, a temporary position of supreme authority. Fabius had served in that capacity. His cautious strategy had kept Rome from catastrophe, but it had also failed to dislodge Hannibal, who had spent more than a year raiding across southern Italy, living off Roman allied territory, and demonstrating to Rome's allies that the Republic could not protect them. The political consequence was predictable. Fabius was not reappointed. Instead, for the campaign season of 216 BC, Rome elected two new consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. The tension between these two men would shape everything that followed at Cannae. Paulus was an experienced commander and a cautious one, closer in temperament to Fabius, aware of Hannibal's ability to exploit overconfidence. Varro was aggressive, politically ambitious, and deeply certain that the problem with Rome's previous campaigns had been insufficient commitment of force. He believed that if Rome simply brought enough soldiers to the field and hit Hannibal directly and hard enough, the Carthaginian army would shatter. This was not an unreasonable belief. It had, after all, been the foundational logic of Roman military success for generations. And in 216 BC, Rome had assembled the resources to test it at maximum scale. The army that marched to meet Hannibal near Cannae in the summer of 216 BC was the largest Rome had ever fielded in a single engagement. Ancient sources vary, but modern historians generally accept a figure of approximately 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. This was not merely a large force, it was a statement of intent, a declaration that Rome intended to use its numerical superiority to simply overwhelm Hannibal's smaller army before any tactical complexity could develop. Polybius, writing roughly 50 years after the battle, gives the Carthaginian army a strength of approximately 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The Numidian and Spanish cavalry in particular represented a quality advantage that would prove decisive. Roman cavalry was comparatively weak, and the Romans knew it, which was part of why they compensated by flooding the infantry center with as many men as they could organize. Their plan was straightforward: push the infantry center into contact with Hannibal's line, use mass and momentum to break through. Let the sheer weight of numbers do what Roman soldiers had always done: advance, hold, and crush. What they had not fully accounted for was the mind on the other side of the field. Hannibal had chosen the site of this engagement with characteristic precision. The area around Cannae, near the Aufidus River in the Apulian Plain, was grain country, flat, open, and exposed. It had been a Roman supply depot, and Hannibal had seized it specifically to force Rome's hand. Roman allies in the region depended on that grain. The Roman Senate could not afford to allow Hannibal to sit on their supply base indefinitely. They had to come and fight. The terrain was also chosen for its effect on Roman tactics. Paulus had argued, with the instincts of a competent commander, that Hannibal should not be engaged on open flat ground where his superior cavalry could operate freely on both flanks. He preferred broken terrain, where the Numidians would be less effective. Varro disagreed, and since the two consuls alternated daily command according to Roman convention, the day that Varro commanded was the day Rome attacked. There is also the matter of the wind. The Volturnus wind blew from the south on the morning of August 2nd, carrying dust across the field in the direction of the Roman lines. Hannibal positioned his army so that the Roman soldiers would be fighting with wind and dust in their eyes. It was a small detail, but Hannibal was a man who thought in small details. His army was arrayed with deliberate strategic intent. The center of his line was formed by his weakest troops, Spanish and Gallic infantry, arranged in a convex bulge that protruded forward toward the Roman formation. On the flanks of this center, he placed his Libyan heavy infantry, his most disciplined and experienced soldiers, held back and angled slightly inward. And on the far flanks, he deployed his cavalry, his Iberian and Gallic horsemen on the left, facing the weaker Roman cavalry, and his Numidian horsemen on the right, facing Rome's allied Italian cavalry. The shape of his line was the trap. But the trap would only work if the Romans did exactly what he expected them to do. And in that calculation, Hannibal was betting on the one force more reliable than any weapon in the ancient world: Roman certainty. He was right to bet on it. To understand what Hannibal designed at Cannae, you need to understand what a double envelopment actually means, because the term flattens something that was, in execution, almost impossibly difficult to achieve. A double envelopment means surrounding an enemy force on both flanks simultaneously, converting a linear battle into a circle, and then tightening that circle until the enemy is packed so densely they cannot fight effectively. Every commander in the ancient world understood the concept. Virtually none of them could execute it, because it required one thing that was almost never available: the ability to trust that the enemy would hold still in the center long enough for the wings to complete their encirclement. What Hannibal recognized, and this is the center of his genius at Cannae, was that he could manufacture that condition. He could make the Romans hold still, not by trapping them externally, but by giving them exactly what they wanted: the sensation of victory. His center was designed to bend backward. The Spanish and Gallic infantry in the middle were not expected to hold firm against 80,000 Romans. They were expected to retreat, slowly, deliberately, in good order, drawing the Roman mass forward and inward as they did so. The Roman soldiers, feeling the enemy give way before them, would press harder. Their formations, already made abnormally deep by Varro's decision to pack men tightly rather than spread the line wide, would compress further. The push from the rear would amplify the push at the front. The Romans would drive themselves deeper into a narrowing space. While this was happening in the center, Hannibal's Libyan infantry on the flanks, those disciplined veterans held back in columns at the edges, would pivot inward. They would turn, like closing doors, and begin moving along the sides of the advancing Roman mass. Simultaneously, the cavalry on both flanks would defeat their Roman counterparts, swing around the battlefield, and close the rear. The geometry would complete itself. The circle would close. And 80,000 men compressed into a space where they could not lift their weapons properly, could not turn, could not retreat, would find themselves simply waiting to die. The precision required was extraordinary. The center had to retreat at the right pace, not so fast that the Romans sensed a rout, not so slow that the flanks could not complete their movement. The Libyan infantry had to pivot at exactly the right moment. The cavalry had to win their engagements quickly and return in time to seal the rear before the Romans realized what was happening. It required his subordinate commanders to understand not just their orders, but the entire architecture of the plan. to feel, in real time, when to move and when to hold. And it required Hannibal to read the battle from the inside, positioned close enough to see what was happening and respond, while managing the psychological weight of what he had set in motion. The morning of August 2nd broke hot. The Volturnus wind was already moving when the armies began to form. Varro held command that day. The Romans drew up in their traditional formation, but with modifications that Varro believed would maximize his numerical advantage. He narrowed the frontage of the legions and increased their depth, stacking men behind men in the center to create a battering ram of human mass that would punch through whatever Hannibal placed in front of it. The legions numbered perhaps 70,000 in the infantry center. On the right flank, along the river, 2,000 Roman cavalry were positioned. On the left, 4,000 allied Italian cavalry. Across the field, Hannibal positioned himself in the center with his Spanish and Gallic troops, the men who would bend. He placed his brother Mago nearby. The Libyan veterans anchored both edges of the center line, facing inward, waiting. On the far left, the heavy Iberian and Gallic cavalry under Hasdrubal, not to be confused with his brother-in-law, faced the Roman horsemen. On the far right, the Numidians faced the Italian allies. The Romans advanced. The dust rose. The wind pushed it back into Roman faces. On the left flank, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry crashed into the Roman horsemen along the riverbank. The Romans had no room to maneuver, the river on one side, the advancing infantry formations on the other. The engagement was brief and savage. Roman cavalry was always the weakest element of their army, and here they were penned and outmatched. They broke. Hasdrubal, rather than pursuing them across the field, turned his cavalry immediately and drove it behind the Roman line toward the Italian allied cavalry on the opposite flank. In the center, the collision had begun. 80,000 Romans struck Hannibal's line, and the line bent. It bent slowly. The Spanish and Gallic soldiers in the middle gave ground grudgingly, step by step, holding their formation even as they retreated, maintaining enough resistance to keep the Romans believing they were fighting and winning rather than being guided into a pocket. This was not a rout, it was choreographed contraction, and it required from those soldiers a discipline that history rarely acknowledges, the discipline of controlled defeat. The Romans pressed harder. They could feel the enemy moving backward. The men in the rear pushed forward. The formations thickened. The space inside the Roman mass began to compress. Men who had been fighting with room to swing their weapons now found themselves pressed against the men beside them. The rear ranks pushed into the front ranks. The front ranks had nowhere to go except deeper into the enemy, which was exactly where Hannibal needed them. It was at this point, as the center bent and the Roman mass compressed and advanced, that the Libyan infantry on both flanks began to pivot. They turned inward, columns becoming lines, lines beginning to close like two hands reaching for each other across a table. Polybius describes this movement with the admiration of a military man who understood exactly what he was witnessing. The Libyans, he writes, moved in disciplined order, their weapons equipped largely from arms captured at Trebia and Trasimene, Roman weapons used now against Roman soldiers. They pressed into the sides of the advancing Roman mass. The Romans on the flanks of the infantry formation began to encounter unexpected resistance from an unexpected direction. Men turned to look sideways and found the enemy already there. The instinct to push forward continued in the center, even as the edges began to understand what was happening. This is the mechanical horror of what Hannibal had constructed. The Romans could not communicate across a formation of 70,000 men. The center did not know what was happening on the edges. The edges could not reach the center. The army, as an organism capable of responding to new information, had already ceased to function. Then Hasdrubal's cavalry arrived at the rear. It had ridden across the back of the battlefield, dispatching the Italian allied cavalry on the opposite flank. And now it closed the circle from behind. The Romans were encircled on all sides, flanked left, flanked right, pressed from the front, sealed from the rear. The geometry was complete. The killing that followed lasted, by ancient accounts, for several hours. Inside the encirclement, the conditions were catastrophic. The Romans were packed so tightly that men who were not wounded could not fall down. Those who fell were pressed upright by the bodies around them. Men tried to dig their way under the press and were trampled. Some, according to Livy, buried their own faces in the earth, trying to suffocate themselves rather than wait. The weapons of Hannibal's soldiers moved through the compressed mass methodically. There was almost no space for the Romans to defend themselves effectively. Their shields were too close to use. Their swords were trapped at their sides. The question was no longer whether Rome would lose. The question was how many Romans would die before it was over. When it was over, the ancient sources give numbers that remain difficult to confirm with certainty, but are consistent enough in their magnitude to accept as broadly accurate. Polybius estimates approximately 70,000 Roman and allied soldiers killed. Livy's numbers are similar. Modern historians, working from the ancient sources and contextual analysis, generally accept a range of 50 to 70,000 dead in a single afternoon. Among the dead were 80 senators serving as soldiers that day, both censors, 29 of the 48 military tribunes. The consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who had opposed the engagement, died on the field rather than flee. Varro survived. He escaped with approximately 70 cavalry. In Carthage, when the news arrived along with 3 bushels of gold rings collected from the fingers of dead Roman knights, the Senate reportedly struggled to believe it, not because the victory seemed impossible, but because it seemed too complete. Hannibal's general Maharbal urged an immediate march on Rome itself. According to Livy, he told Hannibal that if they left at once, Hannibal would dine in the capital within 5 days. Hannibal refused. The reasons for that decision have been debated for 2,000 years. In Rome, the news arrived on a summer evening that would never fully end for the generation that survived it. The historian Livy describes the days following Cannae with a detail and an emotional intensity that suggests he is drawing on sources close to the event, or on a civic memory so powerful it had lost none of its weight 2 centuries later. Women ran into the streets. The forum fell silent. Senators moved through the city in a shock that looked to observers almost indistinguishable from grief. Rome had lost, by most conservative estimates, somewhere between 15 and 20% of its entire adult male citizen population in a single day. That figure requires a moment of reflection, not a lost battle, not a military setback that could be absorbed and recovered from with a generation of effort. A catastrophe so concentrated, so swift, that the social structure it struck could not immediately process what had happened to it. Entire families had been erased. The senatorial class, the military and political leadership of the Republic, had been gutted in a single afternoon on a field in Apulia. The immediate Roman response was, by historical standards, remarkable. There was panic. There was weeping in the streets. There were proposals, attributed by Livy to some unnamed Romans, to abandon the city entirely and flee overseas. But the institutional reflex of the Republic held. The Senate met. Decisions were made. A dictator was not appointed. The mechanism for doing so required a consul to preside over the election, and Paulus was dead. But Marcus Junius Pera was named as interrex and took emergency measures. New legions were authorized. Slaves were enrolled as soldiers, something Rome had never done before. The minimum property qualification for military service was temporarily suspended. Boys below the standard age of service were taken into the legions. Even men who had been convicted of crimes and were in prison were offered freedom in exchange for military service. The Allies were the immediate crisis. Cannae had demonstrated, in terms that no political argument could obscure, that Rome could not protect the cities and peoples of Italy from Hannibal's army. Several significant Italian communities now defected to Carthage, most crucially Capua, one of the wealthiest and most strategically important cities in Italy. Other communities in Apulia, Samnium, and Bruttium followed. Hannibal was suddenly in possession not just of a field army, but of a territorial base in the heart of Italy. In the Iberian Peninsula, Philip V of Macedon, watching the events of 216 BC with careful attention, made diplomatic contact with Hannibal and began discussions about an alliance. a development that would eventually pull Rome into a second front and expand the war across the eastern Mediterranean. In Carthage itself, the reaction was more complicated than it might appear. The victory at Cannae did produce celebrations and a renewed sense of Carthaginian power. But the Carthaginian Senate, composed largely of merchant aristocrats skeptical of military adventures and deeply conscious of the cost of sustained warfare, was not prepared to fully commit the resources Hannibal needed. Reinforcements were sent, but slowly and in insufficient numbers. The political will to end the war with a march on Rome itself, even when the military moment may have been available, was not present in Carthage's governing class. Hannibal would fight in Italy for 16 more years. He would never again achieve a battlefield victory of the scale of Cannae, and he would never see Rome. Hannibal eventually left Italy in 203 BC, recalled to Africa to defend Carthage against a Roman invasion led by a general who had studied every defeat Hannibal had inflicted on Rome and built a career on understanding them. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he had been one of the survivors of Cannae, a young officer who had rallied fleeing soldiers after the disaster and kept them from abandoning the Republic in its darkest moment. At Zama, in 202 BC, Scipio faced Hannibal in battle and defeated him, using, with characteristic historical irony, a variation of the envelopment tactics Hannibal himself had pioneered. The Second Punic War ended. Carthage was stripped of its overseas territories, its navy, and its military independence. Hannibal himself lived on, continuing to serve Carthage in various political capacities, until Roman diplomatic pressure forced him into exile. He died in Bithynia, in modern-day Turkey around 183 BC, by his own hand according to ancient sources, to avoid capture by Roman agents. He was in his early 60s. He had spent approximately 45 years in a war that had defined his entire existence. What Cannae left behind is not simply a body count. What it left behind is harder to measure and more consequential for human history. For Rome, Cannae was the forge. The defeat was so catastrophic that it forced a transformation of Roman military thinking that would not have occurred otherwise. The man most responsible for that transformation was Scipio Africanus, who drew directly on the lessons of the Punic Wars to create a more flexible, more tactically sophisticated Roman army than the one Hannibal had destroyed on the Aufidus Plain. The Rome that emerged from the Second Punic War was not the same republic that had marched into it. It was tougher, more adaptive, more willing to learn from defeat, and ultimately, in ways Hannibal could not have anticipated, more dangerous. For military history, Cannae became the permanent template for the doctrine of envelopment. When Alfred von Schlieffen designed the German war plan that was attempted at the opening of the First World War, he explicitly invoked Cannae as his model. When Erwin Rommel studied encirclement tactics in the North African campaign, Cannae was in the background. Every military academy that teaches the concept of double envelopment teaches it through the lens of August II, 216 BC. The battle entered the conceptual vocabulary of war so completely that it is now simply a word, a cannae, used to describe any attempt to encircle and annihilate an enemy force, rather than simply defeat it in a frontal engagement. 2,200 years of military history, and the event still has its own noun. For Carthage, Cannae was a victory that contained the seeds of final defeat. Not because Hannibal failed after it. He did not fail exactly. He simply fought a different kind of war, one of attrition and political maneuvering for 16 more years. But Cannae revealed the structural weakness of Carthage's position. A city whose governing class could not translate a battlefield victory into strategic commitment, whose resources were not organized for sustained warfare on the Italian peninsula, whose political will collapsed at the moment when total investment might have ended the war. Hannibal had built the most perfect killing machine in the ancient world, and then had no army to replace it with. The victory at Cannae was so complete that it could not be repeated, and the war had to be won more than once. What does it mean that a single day, a few hours on a flat plain in southern Italy, could reshape the trajectory of Western civilization? That the deaths of 70,000 men on a summer afternoon could determine which culture would come to dominate the Mediterranean world, which language would spread across Europe, which legal and political traditions would eventually underpin the institutions of the modern West. History does not often offer moments this concentrated. Most of what we call historical change is slow, distributed, and impossible to point to precisely. Cannae is different. You can stand on that plain today. You can feel the Volturnus wind. You can look across the flat ground toward the Aufidus and understand, with a clarity that few historical sites allow, exactly what happened here and why it changed everything that came after. Hannibal Barca was not a hero in any simple sense. He was a man of extraordinary intelligence and ferocious commitment, who caused the deaths of tens of thousands of people over the course of a career that consumed his entire life. He inflicted suffering across Italy on a scale that the communities in his path would not recover from for generations. He was capable of acts of calculated cruelty, as well as acts that ancient sources describe as conspicuous mercy, the inconsistency of a man who operated by strategic logic rather than by a fixed moral code. But he was also, without serious dispute, the most gifted battlefield tactician of the ancient world. What he built at Cannae was not simply a military victory. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that human intelligence, applied with sufficient precision and discipline to the problem of violence, could produce results so disproportionate to the resources involved that they seemed to belong to a different category of event entirely. Rome survived Cannae, but it was never quite the same Rome again. And Hannibal, exiled, hunted, aging, and finally alone in a room in Bithynia with the knowledge that Roman agents were at the door, was never quite the same Hannibal either. He had spent everything to prove a point, and the point was proved. The question history leaves us with is the one Cannae has always asked. When a man of extraordinary ability dedicates his entire existence to the destruction of an enemy and succeeds completely on a single afternoon, what exactly has he won? And what does the civilization that survived him owe to the men who died in the trying? Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story moved you the way it moves everyone who encounters it, share it with someone who needs to understand what a single day can do to the world.